Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. Today, my guest is April Harter. April is a psychotherapist and anti-racism coach who has pioneered a new method to help white people learn how to get out of the matrix of performative allyship. We talk about the differences between allyship and awareness versus her interventions to help perpetrators of racism deeply change their behaviors. We also compare and contrast unconscious racism to unconscious homophobia and how to begin to work on and heal from them. To find April and her anti-racism programs, go to aprilharter.com. That's April, Harter.com. Hi, April. Welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
So, April, you have just started doing a lot of different new exciting things, which I'm excited to talk to you about. But before we jump in, I wonder if you could tell us how you first started doing anti-racism coaching.
All right. So, well, first of all, and I say this a lot, but I just got to say it, which is that I didn't expect to do anti-racism coaching. I first started out, in private practice, and I just kind of fell into it. And how I got into anti-racism coaching is that I was very concerned about what happened in Charlottesville, and I wanted to do something about it. And I didn't know what to do. And so then I decided, I thought to myself, maybe I can make a difference in the psychotherapy community. But the other thing, so Charlottesville is one thing. The other thing is that when I moved from Texas to Colorado in 2016, I started noticing as the white psychotherapists were committing microaggressions unconsciously, and they didn't know it, okay? Now, at the time, I was actually quite traumatized by this. I didn't realize I was quite traumatized by this. I was quite triggered. They portrayed a lot of denial, intellectualizing, different defense mechanisms, okay? But still at the time I wanted to make a difference. So I was struggling with racial trauma from being exposed to all these microaggressions that I had never experienced, honestly, in my career. I've experienced microaggressions on a personal level for the most part outside of my career, but not really with my fellow psychotherapists and social workers, not exactly. They kind of knew but that was Texas, But then when I moved to Colorado, it was just something totally different. And I had never experienced that before. And so on one hand, I had not, because I look back on it now, and at the time I didn't know I was struggling with racial trauma healing that I needed to do. And then at the same time, there was that injustice as well. So it was two things at once. So then I created a Facebook group, and that's how I initially that's what gave me the motivation to later start coaching. Because, Nick, what happened was that I started coaching, or rather I started facilitating this Facebook group, and there was a lot of interracial squab basically happening. There was a lot of interracial conflict happening. And again, looking back on now, I can look and say, wow, both sides had not really healed. And so there was a lot of escalation happening in these Facebook groups among my peers, right? So then the white therapists were constantly kind of really begging the POC therapists, could you help me, show me the way? And the POC therapists are like, some of them said, hey, here's a recommendation, here's what you do. But there really wasn't a solution, actually. In fact, there actually is no evidence-based practice to treat racial trauma. So the Facebook group, and I forgot to add this part, this Facebook group was meant to help POC, and this is ironic, isn't it? I hadn't healed from racial trauma, but I wanted to help POC heal from racial trauma, okay? And so we all just wanted to fix it with our therapeutic selves. We had white folks in the group who hadn't explored, their unconscious racism. Me, the person facilitating the group, hadn't healed from racial trauma. I suspect lots of other POC colleagues of mine hadn't healed. But at the same time, there also aren't very many ways to reform the perpetrators of racism. That's one. Two, there isn't an evidence-based practice to treat racial trauma. So that's like, this is so fresh and new. It was like the Wild Wild West in this Facebook group, okay? So then, after seeing all of this, I'm a natural born leader. So I was like, okay, I'm seeing a problem here. And I also got, of course, very social worky. Like, okay, the white people are asking for help, but so I go, okay, let me refer you to somebody. So I started looking, I couldn't find anything. I'm like, I'm not really finding a way to help these people. So then I was kind of left thinking maybe I should do this because I have an emotional interest in this. I was I had a connection. I was like, I felt very like there was something in me. Like, I feel like I could make a difference. So then I started coaching people on an hourly rate before I created the program. And I did that for 6 months, and I did over 100, coaching sessions. But yeah, it was the Facebook group that really helped identify initially that there wasn't really much out there for white people to reform. And at the time, I didn't see it as reform because at the time, too, I was also teaching performative allyship because that is exactly what most POC and whites teach too. We all teach each other a bunch of performative allyship.
Can I pause you there?
Yeah.
Can you help us understand what performative allyship is?
Yeah. So performative allyship has to do with really telling somebody how to be.
Got it. So instead of being authentically anti-racist, you're just telling them this is the mask you put on if you want to be anti-racist.
Yeah. So these are the rules. It's like you got to follow this. So, anytime you go into Google and you'll see hundreds, if not thousands of articles. Here's the 10 ways to be an ally to a POC. And I'm looking at this now at the time, I thought that was legit because that's what was around. The problem, Nick, is when I started coaching. So when I started coaching, I was like, okay, this is not working. And I didn't really figure out until about 4 or 5 months ago that basically, I was teaching performative allyship and that most POC and whites alike teach performative allyship because that's what we do. That's what's popular. That's the standard.
And so you've talked about that as the standard being the performative allyship and cultivating awareness, but where yours version is different is that you actually do intervention. So can you say more about how that's different?
Yeah. So what I do is, I think being that this is Queer Spirit, it's such a cool podcast. I think a really good example of this to understand this, that in coaching, I do shadow work. And so essentially, I'm sure many of the listeners are familiar with the term, but if you're not, shadow work is looking at the things that we don't like in ourselves. And it evokes a lot of cognitive dissonance. And so essentially, that's what really makes my work quite different, is that we do the necessary shadow work to reform the perpetrator so that with compassion and love, so that white people are able to authentically love POC. And really, it almost always boils down to a white person not loving themselves enough. And each of them doesn't love themselves enough in a certain way. And so what happens is that, and I'll connect to the performative allyship, is that, critical race theory is very much academic and weighty and intellectual. So it's what I noticed early on is that we're missing that piece that as therapists, it's missing this emotional piece, this really heart-centered, emotional, transformational piece. What is this piece that's missing? And one of course, and we could talk about this in a little bit, but one of the defense mechanisms is intellectualizing. So basically the performative allyship is, if we look at it from a POC, okay, so what performative allyship does is that it actually becomes a barrier to authentic connection, because I equate it to conditional versus unconditional love. Because with performative allyship, there are conditions. When you do authentic anti-racism, there are no conditions. And so I realized all the rules need to be thrown out, period, in order to have that authentic connection, that interracial connection, that this elephant in the room. So essentially, I look at it very systemically. I look at it as a whole, not just one side or the other. I look at it I see it as, okay, we have POC who have not healed from racial trauma, and they're very triggered by whites who perpetrate unconscious racism. And their unconscious racism is very much at the root is unresolved trauma. So it's like, you know, when you have these two sides with unresolved trauma coming together, that's the reason why, I mean, I see this all the time on television, on the internet. What do we say when we do we need to have these racial discussions. We need to have more discussions on race. Okay, but if you notice, every time we have these discussions about race, do you notice, Nick, everybody starts to escalate? I mean, people escalate. Or the white people there are just frozen. Like, I'm not sure. What if I say something racist? You know, and then the POC's like, well, here we go with another white person that doesn't get it. You know, so it's like, ding, 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 ding. I mean, it's just all over the place. So basically, you have basically two wounded souls together in one room, and we're thinking we can just talk it out without actually healing first. And then we can begin to have these deeper conversations. So we're really missing that healing piece. We really are.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing is it also takes a lot of really deep commitment to doing the healing work on both sides, right?
So, gosh.
And that's a big commitment.
A commitment that a lot of times people don't want to do.
Exactly. Which is why I think it's so awesome and amazing that you're doing this and you're going to build an empire.
Yeah. And you know what, Nick? The core of that is shame, even on both sides. So like, it's shame, you know, it's just a different type of shame. So like for white folks, the shame is like, it becomes white guilt, which is like, I did something racist, either overtly or unconsciously racist. And I know it. And I've made a lot of mistakes in that regard, to the point where that guilt has now transformed into shame. And now I hate myself. And then that shame just drives a lot of these defenses, right? And then for the POC, oh my gosh, like the racial trauma, like there is such shame in saying that you are wounded because a white person perpetrated racism to you. Like there's a lot of shame involved there. Like, I'm a victim. I don't want to see myself as a victim. I'm okay. Everything's all right. Everything's going to be okay. So you also got defense mechanisms on both sides. There's levels of denial on both sides. So it's like, again, you have unresolved trauma for white folks, and then you have that core, and then you have that are struck like a match with a racial trigger. And a racial trigger is whenever a white person has a discussion about race or racism, or even if they see a black person come into the room, like something that just evokes the whole in their mind, the whole topic of race and racism. Okay. And so that's one thing. And then for POC, it's like the disempowerment, the shame. And for a lot of POC, one of the greatest things that they lose is self-esteem. So it's like the shame of saying, there's a lot of shame affiliated with saying, well, if someone's racist to me, that hurt me, and now I'm really sad, and now I feel weak. So the barrier for POC, I find, in getting healing for racial trauma is that denial. I'm going to be okay. I can do just fine. And POC essentially also a lot of time don't really see much hope in white people getting better. So they become very cynical. And that has everything to do with depression, which is part of racial battle fatigue. So it's like, they're like, well, white people they don't want to get better. So why should I care? Like, why? I don't think they're going to get any better anytime soon, which is understandable that they say that, because the truth is that perpetrators do have a lot of, defenses as to why they don't think they should have to examine the ways that white psychology, and part of white cultural psychology, is racism. It's the bedrock of America. So it's like saying, well, I'm functional, everything's okay, I've got a house, I've got a car, I've got a family, I've got people I love in my life. So why do I need to explore racism when I pretty much got everything I need? So it really comes to the point here, beautiful point you're saying here about motivation and investment. It's a huge commitment. And I'm going to tell you that the commitment that is required. So what I've learned since I've been coaching, the level of commitment that is required is like, if we say that 10 is like the highest commitment, and as far as love for a POC, and 1 being, I hardly have any POC, we're talking you have to be at a 10 or an 11 to coach with me. because all the people that coach with me have some seriously deep, loving relationships with POC. And their unconscious racism has now interfered in these relationships to the point where they're like, I'm not going to let this interfere in my relationship. They're fully invested. So when we say Black Lives Matter and we say that people's lives matter, I mean, I find that can be quite a trendy phrase, because then it's like saying, like we say for queer folks, it's like, well, you care, you have a rainbow flag, you're an ally, but do you know any gay folks? Do you have loving relationships with queer folk? Right? And so it's the same thing with white folks too, which is, to what degree are these relationships? Are they just acquaintances? And that, by the way, can't be forced. That's the other thing, is that it can't be forced. So there are a lot of barriers before a person actually gets coaching with me. It's just really radically different.
Yeah, and this is also something that's really interesting to me that I wanted to talk about, which is the intersection of unconscious racism and unconscious homophobia, and how those, not that one is worse or harder, but how they're similar and how they're different, because like you were saying, there are people who say, oh, I'm okay with gay people, but I don't want one in my family, or I don't want my child to be, right? Or as long as they don't come near me. And some people could say that about POC, like, oh, I'm okay with gay people with, POC, but I don't have any of them as my friends, or I don't want them doing my hair, or, something like that.
Absolutely. And where I will say is that a lot of my coaching clients essentially tell me, they're like, April, your whole paradigm of what you do could be used for like any form of bigotry. And I'm like, yeah, it can. And I suspect that my work will be very much inspiring reforming perpetrators, period. So it is those defense mechanisms, the thread of it all is narcissism, and narcissism is taught in culture, discrimination. So what ties them all together? Yes, but also queer folk. It's like whether you're white queer, POC queer, whether you're disabled, whether, whatever your level of marginalization within that social stratification. In other words, white men that are straight carry, in America, the greatest amount of social capital, which gives them access to all kinds of literal capital, and so going all the way to the bottom of the totem pole, which is essentially a non-binary POC trans folk. That is like straight up, like that's why they are killed in record numbers in the United States. So you have different, and this is where we get to intersectionalism. So really, as we stack those layers of marginalization, the higher the likelihood that there will be a normalization of narcissistic behavior towards the people, and more exponential, the lower the totem pole it's seen. So that's that intersectional piece. So this is where we get into the parallel of narcissism, violence, and discrimination.
Mm-hmm. So diving in a little deeper into your model, specifically, one of the things that you focus on is racist signatures. So can you say more about what that is? And I know there's 42 of them, so we can't go over all of them, but
I love to hear you say that. You like the racist signatures? Like, yes. Yes, we can absolutely talk about the racist signatures. So after coaching all those folks, with all those sessions, I started noticing a pattern, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And I started noticing, and then after I kind of thought, these are defense mechanisms. But it wasn't quite the same as the typical defense mechanism. And I will break down the 7, and then we'll get into the 42. So the 7, so I call them the core 7 racist signatures, and then we have racist signature patterns. So it helps to first know this for the 7, and I label them 1 through 7, okay? So the first one is denial. So I call it racist denial. And I call it specifically racist denial because in all of the signatures, I say racist before the defense mechanism, because there needs to be a racial trigger involved for this defense. So for example, if you're white and queer, then if someone is exhibiting homophobia, then there would be like homophobic denial or something like that. That trigger has to be that element. So that kind of indicates there. So it's racist denial, racist intellectualizing, racist Saber Ism, racist perfectionism, which is not a classic defense mechanism, but it actually ended up being. This is the pattern that I saw. The fifth one is racist projection. The sixth is what I call racist rejection of whiteness. And the seventh is racist leadership. So racist denial is pretty self-explanatory, in your denial that you're acting in racist ways. The denial is actually the most difficult to penetrate in reforming naturally. The denial is hard. Racist intellectualizing, again, very self-explanatory. You're intellectualizing. Instead of getting heart-centered, it's very much about facts and information and really not connecting the heart and the mind. That's where that racist intellect. So it's like a defense mechanism, but we're going to get on facts, but we're not going to really say how we feel. So this is avoidance of feelings. The third one is Saber Ism. And Saber Ism is whenever a white person has this feeling in them that they need to save a POC from themselves, right? So this is similar to like co-enabling or enabling a person, okay? So there's no respect of a POC's autonomy, okay? And it's easy to understand why white people get into that Saberism, because after all, POC have been, discriminated. They are in very many ways disempowered. So that's why it tends to lead white people to shift into Saberism, right? And then the fourth one is racist perfectionism. Racist perfectionism has to do with, I'm going to be the perfect white ally. I'm going to follow the rules of anti-racism. That's one of the biggest ones. It is a moral dilemma. And it's really not about the POC. So the piece that I'm kind of missing about this 7 is that all of these defense mechanisms are there to protect the ego. And it's really not about the POC and having that authentic connection. It's really about, I don't really want to go there and feel that shame. I don't want to go there. So there's a series of defenses. And like I said, racist projection is about really jumping on another white person. Oh, that damn white person, like they're so evil and terrible, the KKK. So there's like this big focus on thinking about, in fact, a lot of white people get stuck in racist projection because it's in a way so much easier to focus on the big criminals versus the microaggressions that they perpetrate. So it's like, well, I'm not as bad, like that other person. So it becomes the defense mechanism. It's racist projection. And then racist rejection of whiteness is akin to, racial appropriation and cultural appropriation. So this is whenever a white person literally, and very much it's about shame. They actually, deep in their heart, want to connect with POC so bad that they reject as many aspects of their whiteness as possible. So this is like, Rachel Dolezal. Rachel Dolezal is a perfect example of someone who, and I'll get into it, which goes into a 7-6. So externally, and actually, let me get to the 7, then I'll get back to that Rachel Dolezal. So the last one, which is racist leadership. So racist leadership is whenever a white person essentially has really perfected their performative allyship. And they start teaching POC and they start teaching things about race and racism, but it's rooted in performative allyship. And this isn't in my ebook because I got to update my ebook. And so they become the epitome of performative allyship. And a perfect example of that, bless her heart, would be, and I'm trying to remember her name. One was Rachel Dolezal, but the other one is the one who did the book White Fragility, Robin DiAngelo. So like Robin DiAngelo teaches performative allyship. She understands what performative allyship is, but I can tell in her writing, she hasn't really fully done, because again, I just invented something, Nick. So it's like, she hasn't even gotten the chance. You know what I'm saying? So white folks haven't gotten the chance to work with me and do this. So I have compassion, oh, you just don't know. You're doing performative allyship. You know what I'm saying? So these are examples. Rachel Dolezal goes into a 7-6. So now we get into the racist signatures. So the racist signatures are a combination of the 7. So what you do is externally, so let's say you're racially triggered. And for Rachel Dolezal, that racial trigger was growing up in a family with Black adopted kids. It's like on the Netflix special. And her parents are white. And she watched her parents act in violent ways towards her siblings, her adopted siblings. And she was absolutely ashamed by that because she knew that they were perpetrating racism, violence, etc. And she just didn't want to have anything to do with her whiteness, because when she looked at her parents, it was like, I don't want to be like them. Literally, she did racist rejection of whiteness. She literally, I like to use her as an example because it's really an extreme, but quite I mean, you can't get it twisted or confused with Rachel Dolezal. I feel so bad for her because that shame drove her to completely reject her whiteness. So externally, she went into a 7 of leadership where, I mean, she was in charge of the NAACP. I mean, she was teaching, critical race theory, teaching African-American studies, Black studies, etc. And that's where that leadership comes into play, right? And then it was driven, so that externally she's going into a 7, that's driven by the 6, which is the racist rejection of whiteness. So the way that she rejects her whiteness further and how it comes out is in this 7 of leadership. Okay. And then what drove it on, you can see that in her body language, is shame. And I get it. Like, yeah, she's got plenty of reasons to feel like absolutely shame. So like you get into these layers of, you have the outer band, the inner band, the core. And that core feeling is where the shadow is. Those are the feelings that white people try to avoid. Those are those things. And that's the shadow work that must be done. But we do it by layers and coaching together.
Mm-hmm. So then I'm guessing, based on the way you're explaining all this, and it's also interesting because we were just talking before we were recording about your interest in astrology, I could see how combining all 3 of these different layers together are how you get the 42. Do I have that right?
That's right. Yes.
It's the different combinations that you get 42 different combinations.
Yeah. 42 different flavors.
Got it.
Yes. I'm being silly, but it's true. It's 42 different flavors.
Yeah. So it's like you have basically like your sun sign and your rising sign and your moon sign, and that makes up the different combination.
I will tell you, one of my friends actually told me this, April, do you realize you kind of created the I Ching of racism? And I said, yeah. And I do practice the I Ching, among other things. So I was like, yeah, I kind of did. I kind of created the I Ching of anti-racism. Or of racism, understanding the psychology of racism. Yes.
Yeah. So in starting to wrap up, can you just share with our listeners about the different offerings that you have?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. I have a couple of things. And I'm just going to make some recommendations to kind of start. I think that as any informed consumer, it's important to kind of get your feet wet. I think we all do this. I mean, we try freebies. Like, we need to kind of get an opportunity to explore and get it, dip your toe in the water. So I'd say the best way to get yourself, introduced to my work is because a lot of content I'm dropping on Instagram. You would go into Instagram and you would type in April Harter LCSW. So April Harter LCSW into Instagram, and you will find me. That's why I would say, follow me for a few weeks, follow me and start watching my lives, start watching my IGTVs, look at my posts, begin to immerse yourself into my content. And then if you feel like, hey, I'm kind of jiving with this feels pretty good, then you can go to my website at aprilharter.com and you could download the free 5-week course. Yes, the free 5-week course is going to drip. So it drips. And what is dripping? It means that the content is released once a week. Now, some of you may think, well, why not just do it all right at once? Well, because actually a lot of the work that you're going to be doing, just like I do in coaching, it's just a lot of introspection. I would really be selling everybody short in this freebie if I just let everybody just go through the whole thing. Slowing down in this level of shadow work that you're doing is so key. So like a lot of people will. I want you to also understand, listeners, that in reading some of the stuff, the content that I put out there, that alone is racially triggered. I tell my coaching clients this all the time. What we're getting ready to do, I'm triggering because I'm a Black woman in here. The stuff that you're going to be doing is triggering. And it's like a trigger within a trigger within a trigger. So know that. So you're not a bad person if you cry. White tears are not the devil, despite what most of my fellow POCs say. White tears and white fragility, it has to do with when a white person has unresolved trauma and it's just coming out. It's actually a crisis moment. It's nothing evil. It's crisis.
Well, I imagine it's also a gateway that they have to pass through to do this work. Yeah,
absolutely. And so it's like, but unfortunately, they usually get stuck there because they're told to repress their feelings. There's topic, and the POC are going to say, that get those white tears out of here, get them out. Well, I understand why they're saying that, because those white tears are triggering for them. They haven't healed from racial trauma, so those white tears are going to be really painful. So it's not a good idea for POC unless they've healed from their racial trauma, it is not good for them to be around white folks in a way to do this type of like co-working. It's just, again, you've got two unresolved things going down at the same time. But anyway, but yes, so then I have the freebie, the 5-week course that drips, releases. And then I also have the network, which is very, very newly minted. And the network is, so like if the freebies feel good, but you're still not really fully ready to make that kind of financial commitment to get into coaching, then I would say the next step, which is still incredible, beautiful content, is the network. And it's like $24.99 a month, and it's at racistsignature.com. And basically it's a community. I created a community where white people can explore racism with love and compassion. So this is really to go against the grain of like, I'm evil because I'm white and I will always be racist. No, that's not true. Racism is a behavior. It's something that can be worked on, despite what, it's not such a beast that we can't work on it. It just has to be one person at a time. It's not something that, you know, we can force anybody to feel better about POC. Like, it's something that, yes, it's a commitment. It's something that has to come from inside. And we engage in beautiful introspective conversations in there. And then, of course, finally, we have coaching. And the coaching is the Cadillac, you know, creme de la creme service. And I would say that's the final destination. I mean, once you get to that point, you know, and you feel better and you're ready for coaching, then it's like, yeah. And a lot of the people that come to me for coaching have looked at my content for like weeks, if not months. And they really kind of let that marinate a little bit inside their hearts and minds. And again, I mean, the tendency is they feel a lot of guilt and shame because they've hurt a POC that they really, really deeply, intimately know and love, and they don't want to hurt them again. So it's like a crisis situation they need to work through.
And the coaching is a group program that is 7 or 8 weeks. Is that right?
This is a good question. We're in transition, Nick.
Oh, okay.
So
we won't put anything in stone right now.
No, it's good. No, it's all good. So, well, I don't know. With me, nothing's ever in stone, but except that I'm going to do anti-racism all the time. But so yes, it's a group program. It's 7 weeks long. I've actually kind of now made it 8 weeks just for one extra week of processing. But in the future, it's going to actually become a 9-month program. Oh,
awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I could see how something like this, you know, I don't know if you could really get through it all in terms of the processing of the internal work in just 2 months.
Yeah. For the most part, it's about grief work. So the shadow work is very much about grieving. And so really unpacking and uncovering the trauma that's driving those racist signature patterns. And once you understand that, then it's about grief work. And so essentially, one other thing I want to tell you is that one of the things that I encourage, and actually part of what is required in the contract to work with me, because we are going to be talking about, you know, some very painful emotions, is it is required that people either be seeing a therapist when they work with me, or they're getting some type of help where they're able to process their feelings outside of coaching, because I don't do therapy in coaching. So it's like I do a lot of psychoeducation, and we unpack a little bit, but a lot of the main heavy processing that's happening is really happening outside of coaching. So I really just guide them through that psychoeducation, and then many of them are now doing the homework, which is deeply introspective. But if they come across a barrier that's too painful, that's when they're going to process that, you know, with a therapist or with someone else.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Yeah.
So April, can you share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish?
Well, I think being an intersectional feminist does that. I think it completely consolidates all those aspects, you know, being a Black woman, you know, I mean, that's my identity. I mean, I say this all the time. I mean, I'm a Black, queer, radical feminist, and I'm very proud of that. And it comes from a long lineage. So I think that, you know, feeling proud of my identity and always making sure, like in all my publications and my bios, that like people know that, like off the bat. I think that helps people get a sense of, wow, you know, like this is part of what April's all about, and this is part of her story. This is where she comes from. So that kind of really gives people insight, and it just self-esteem wise makes me feel so good.
Great. Yeah. Well, April, thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for bringing this work to the world. I'm really excited to watch it grow.
Well, you're welcome. I was glad to do this interview. It's fantastic.
Do you feel lost or stuck? Or are you alone on your healing journey? If you're seeking guidance or support, I'm here to help. I offer online coaching and counseling for queer spiritual folks from all over. Schedule your free consultation with me now by going to queerhealingjourneys.com. I look forward to supporting you on your path. To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. This will help us reach and support more queer people all over. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.